My husband died believing that I loved only him. But in the war, a nameless man stole my heart, and I carried that secret with me for more than 70 years. And now, with trembling hands and time running out, I must decide whether to reveal who he was or whether to let silence hide him forever. My name is Dorothy Lorraine Eckhart, but everyone calls me Dot. I'm 93 years old and live alone in an old wooden house in Omaha, Nebraska. This morning the kitchen clock ticks away, the kettle hissing impatiently, and the smell of stale bread mingles with the soap in the sink. Outside, the cold autumn wind rustles the dry leaves against the window, and inside, the silence is so thick I can almost hear my own heartbeat. It was in this very silence that I learned to live with memories I've never shared with anyone. As a young woman, I was sent as a volunteer nurse to the Italian front during World War II. I remember the first time I stepped off a truck into the mud and smell of gunpowder. My hands still soft, believing I could save anyone who came to me. The field hospital was a mixture of ether, smoke, and fear. The tents shook in the wind, but inside the hustle and bustle was constant. Men arriving in droves, some shouting, others just staring blankly into space. Today, looking at my own hands, covered in spots and with paper-thin skin, I try to remember the strength they once held. The 20-something woman who endured sleepless nights, cleaning wounds and holding on to lives, seems so distant that sometimes I wonder if she's still the same person. But there's a memory, a face, a look, that proves that that young woman still lives inside, hidden among the wrinkles and silences. It was during that war that I met the man who would change everything, though my husband, who was fighting on another front, never knew of his existence. And that's why today, sitting in this cold kitchen, I know the time has come to tell him what I never had the courage to say. If you believe that some stories deserve to be told before time erases them, stay with me until the end, and subscribe to the channel to hear other memories that should never be forgotten. The cold of that morning seemed to seep into my bones. I was in the makeshift kitchen of the field hospital, absently stirring the burnt coffee that bubbled in a kettle darkened by time and the constant smoke from the lamps. The bitter aroma mingled with another smell that was already a part of me, the iron of dried blood ingrained in my hands, even after so many washes with harsh soap. Outside, the frost was beginning to melt in drops that ran down the canvas of the tents, creating a rhythmic sound, almost like a heartbeat. The radio crackled, bringing news of the latest battles. They were distant voices, announcing victories and losses, as if speaking of places we would never see, but which shaped the fate of everyone there. I was sipping my coffee slowly, trying to stretch out the little warmth it contained, when I sensed a strange movement at the entrance. 2 soldiers emerged, carrying a man between them. Their boots sank into the mud, leaving a ragged trail to the triage table. His uniform was torn, stained with mud and fresh blood. But what made me stop wasn't his wounds. It was his gaze, a deep, restless blue, seemingly searching for something that wasn't there. He had no identification, no name tag, no documents, just the heavy silence and a wound in his shoulder that seemed more serious than they were willing to admit. Protocol dictated prioritizing the most critical cases with confirmed identification. But in that moment, amid the smell of iron and the cold coffee, something inside me refused to let him go. I felt as if I turned my back, he would disappear forever. Not just from that place, but from my life. The head nurse looked at me, waiting for me to follow the order. But my hands were already reaching for the bandages. With each touch, I realized he was watching me with an intensity that was both disturbing and compelling. He didn't say his name, nor did he try to explain who he was or where he came from. It was as if his silence were a request, or a barrier. And instead of retreating, I wanted to break through. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the loneliness that war instilled in us all. But suddenly, that man who wasn't on the list became the only thing I wanted to keep close. As I cleaned the wound, I heard the radio change its tone from afar, announcing another offensive. The sound seemed to fade, as if the entire world had lowered its volume so that I could hear only the ragged sound of his breathing. There, in that moment, without knowing who he was, I began to carry the weight of a secret that I already sensed I could never share with my husband. He was placed on one of the stretchers at the back, away from the beds that received visits from officers and nurses with direct orders. It was as if they wanted him to go unnoticed, as if his presence were a mistake to be corrected silently. But for me, he was impossible to ignore. There was something in his eyes, that deep blue, clouded with pain, that seemed to draw me closer, even when I was trying to occupy myself with other patients. His name didn't appear on the files hanging at the foot of the beds. I double-checked, as if my mistake of not seeing him there might be a mistake. But it wasn't. Officially, he didn't exist in that hospital. This meant that if something happened, no one would answer for him. The absence of a name was more dangerous than any injury. When I returned to change his dressing, he watched me with a strange calm, as if waiting for me to ask him something. But I didn't. There was a tension in the air, a silent agreement that we shouldn't talk about things that weren't written down. Instead, I did what I could to ease the pain, cleaning the wound with more care than necessary. I felt the weight of responsibility growing, not out of professional obligation, but out of something I couldn't yet name. The other nurses spoke softly as they passed him. I heard one of them mutter that it was best not to get involved, and I realized this wasn't just about medicine. Maybe it was about politics, maybe loyalty, or even survival. But my loyalty at that moment wasn't to orders or reports. It was to this man who, without an identity, seemed to be made only of silence and presence. I remember thinking that, without a name, he was free to be anything, and somehow, that drew me in. While everyone else there wore uniforms and visible stories, he was an enigma, a man who could disappear at any moment, and perhaps that's why I wanted to hold on tighter. That night, lying in my narrow bed, I closed my eyes and still saw his face. It wasn't a handsome face in the usual sense, but there was something about it that stuck in my mind, like a song that refuses to leave my head. I realized I was thinking about him more than I should, and that those thoughts carried a danger that didn't come from the bombs outside, but from within me. The third time I approached to change his bandage, I noticed his lips moving, but no clear words. I leaned in, trying to understand, and realized he was humming a soft, slow, almost childlike melody. It was simple, but it carried a deep sadness, as if each note were drawn from a distant, painful place. I stood there for a few seconds, pretending to arrange the instruments, just to hear more. The melody seemed to come from a time when he hadn't yet known the weight of war. Maybe it was a memory of home, of childhood, or of someone who was no longer alive. I didn't ask. Part of me knew that if I did, the answer might be something I wasn't ready to hear. As I cleaned the wound, I realized I'd started whistling along, without thinking. It was almost a reflex, as if my body recognized the tune before my mind did. He looked up at me, surprised, and something changed in that instant. It wasn't a smile. It was more like he'd found a lost piece of himself. The sounds of the infirmary, hurried footsteps, groans, the crunch of boots in the mud outside, fell away. Only that fragment of song remained, weaving a silent space just for the two of us. and at the same time I felt a tightness in my chest, a sudden fear of what we were creating. This wasn't friendship. This wasn't simple compassion. It was something already beginning to spiral out of my control. When I finished, I put away the bandages and walked away, but he continued to follow my movements with his gaze. For a moment, I had the impression that if I turned around, he would still be singing. And that night, as I tried to sleep, I realized the melody wouldn't leave me. It echoed inside me, as if it were my own memory. And I knew that from that day on, nothing in the war or in my life would ever sound the same again. It was late at night when I was called to check his dressing. The ward was dimly lit, illuminated only by lamps that cast long shadows on the stretchers. The air was cold and heavy, and the silence was broken only by the muffled breathing of the wounded. As I adjusted his pillow so he could sit up, a piece of paper fell out of his shirt, sliding to the floor. It was small, crumpled, folded into 4 pieces so tightly that it looked like it had been hidden for a long time. At first, I considered returning it immediately, but my hand hesitated. I picked up the note, feeling the rough texture of the paper and the weight it carried. A weight that came not from the material itself, but from what might be written there. I looked at him, waiting for him to ask for it back, but he just watched me, silent, with a look that wasn't of fear or urgency, but rather of waiting, as if he wanted to see what I would do. I didn't open it. Maybe out of respect, maybe out of cowardice. I simply slipped the note into my apron pocket, feeling it touch my skin like a hot coal. I continued the treatment as if nothing had happened. I asked if the pain had lessened, and he responded with only a slight nod. The silence between us was heavy, as if each of us were harboring a secret we didn't want, or couldn't, tell the other. That night, upon returning to my quarters, I sat on the edge of my bed and held the note in my hand for several long minutes. A single gesture was enough to unfold it. All it took was the courage to walk through a door that might have no return. But I didn't. I tucked it inside one of the inner folds of my uniform, feeling it pulse against my body as if it had a life of its own. I knew I was carrying something that didn't belong to me, and at the same time I had the strange certainty that, for some reason, he wanted that paper to be with me. The night was especially quiet, as if even the war had receded for a few hours. The infirmary had that familiar smell of ether, mixed with the sweat of tired bodies, and the lamps flickered in the wind that crept in through some poorly closed crack. I walked among the stretchers, checking bandages and adjusting blankets, trying not to wake those who had finally managed to fall asleep. When I reached him, I realized he was awake. His eyes, in the dim light, were that same deep blue that had disconcerted me since day one. I leaned over to change the bandage on the wound, and that was when I felt it. It wasn't a sudden movement, just the slight brush of his fingers against mine. A touch so timid it could have been mistaken for a coincidence, if it weren't for the way it lingered, gentle, yet firm enough for me to know it wasn't involuntary. My heart raced strangely, as if it had been pushed against my chest. The rules, the orders, the invisible presence of my husband on the other side of the world, all of it built up like a wall. But still, I didn't immediately pull my hand away. I felt the heat of his skin, and that heat seemed to speak a language I understood without ever having learned. I looked at him, searching for an explanation, but there were no words, only a look that said that, in that moment, we were just 2 human beings, stripped of uniforms, hierarchy, or history. 2 who, for a brief moment, were not at war. When I finally withdrew my hand, he followed it in the air for a moment, as if to prolong the contact. I returned to my work in silence, but each gesture became more conscious, as if I were touching something fragile and precious. As I left the infirmary, the cold wind hit me, and I realized I could still feel the shape of his fingers on my skin. It was both a physical and an invisible trace, and I knew that, somehow, that touch would change everything. Dawn had barely broken when the shrill wail of sirens cut through the silence of the ward. It was a warning that something was approaching, probably bombing. Protocol dictated moving patients quickly to less exposed areas, but the chaos that ensued made each second seem longer. The lamps swayed, the canvas walls vibrated with the wind and tension, and everyone moved in different directions, trying to protect what they could. I was standing beside his bed when the first explosion echoed in the distance, like a subdued thunderclap. Without thinking, I helped him sit up and, with effort, led him to a sheltered corner of the ward. The space was cramped, almost dark, lit only by a thin sliver of light coming from a crack in the canvas. There, amidst the hurried breathing and the fear that surrounded us, he looked at me with a look that didn't ask for explanation. There were no words. I just felt his hand gently touch my face, as if memorizing every feature. Then suddenly, his lips met mine, warm, urgent, and yet incredibly soft. It was a brief kiss, but deep enough to make me forget where we were. The distant sound of explosions was muffled, as if the entire world had hidden itself to give us that moment. When the lights came back on and the movement resumed, I instinctively recoiled. I adjusted my posture, fixed the scarf in my hair, and acted as if nothing had happened. But inside me, something had broken and, at the same time, something had been born. There was no going back to the way we were before. I spent the rest of the night moving around, pretending to focus on my tasks, but feeling his taste still present, as if every breath were a memory. And I realized the danger of that kiss wasn't just that it was forbidden, but how much I wanted it to happen again. The next morning dawned gray, with a fine drizzle that seemed intent on washing the battlefield clean, but never succeeding. The air was chilly, and the constant squelch of boots in the mud gave the day a slow rhythm. I had spent the night awake, tending to the wounded, but also trying to banish the memory of the kiss that still burned in my mouth. When I went to check his bandages, I noticed he was more awake, with a strange gleam in his eyes. Not exactly joyful, but alive. He sat up with effort and, in an almost conspiratorial tone, said that, if he survived all this, he would come to me. The sentence was said with a certainty that left me speechless. It wasn't a question, nor a request. It was a promise. Inside, I wanted to reply that I would wait for him, that, somehow, I believed in him. But at the same time, I felt the weight of the letters I received from my husband at the front, full of declarations of love and dreams for after the war. I swallowed the words before they could come out. I looked down, pretending to adjust my bandages, and let the silence speak for me. He didn't press. He just kept his eyes fixed on mine, as if he knew there was something I wanted to say but couldn't. That moment hung in the air, like a bridge we never crossed. And, in a way, I realized that perhaps it was for the best. Promises made in war carry a weight that doesn't always survive peace. Still, as I walked away, I felt a strange emptiness, as if I'd lost something I could never get back. And even though I hadn't said anything, I knew part of me had expected this, even if I'd never had the courage to admit it. It was late afternoon when he called me over with a discreet gesture. Sunlight filtered through the canvas of the infirmary, tinting everything a pale gold that contrasted with the constant gray of war. I sat down beside the bed, thinking he wanted water or more painkiller, but he opened his hand and revealed a small worn cloth handkerchief, stained with blood and frayed at the edges. "Keep it for me," he said, his voice low and firm, "until the right day." I held the handkerchief, feeling the roughness of the fabric against my skin. I didn't ask what it meant, or whose blood it was. There was something in his tone that told me this wasn't a story I should hear right now. It was like being handed a key without knowing which door it opened. I folded it carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of my uniform, near where the note I'd never opened was already tucked away. 2 secrets now rested on my heart, as if growing heavier with each breath. I felt his gaze follow me as I put the handkerchief away, as if committing to memory the exact moment it left his hands. That night, while everyone slept, I took the handkerchief from my pocket and examined it by the dim light of a lamp. The dark stain seemed to have sunk deep into the fibers, impossible to wash out. I tried to imagine who he had been before he reached me, where he came from, what he carried. But every time I got closer to an answer, I bumped into the barrier of what I didn't know, and perhaps never would. I put it away again, with almost ceremonial care, perhaps because, somehow, I knew that piece of fabric would bind me to him forever, even if war tore us apart. 2 days later, an officer entered the ward with heavy steps and a hurried look. His uniform was impeccably neat, but there was something impatient and cold in his demeanor. He carried a clipboard stacked with papers and began asking rapid questions about some patients. When he reached me, he fixed his eyes on the corner of the room where he was lying and asked, "Who is that man?" My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my expression neutral. The clipboard awaited my answer as if it were a sentence. I took a deep breath and said, in the steadiest voice I could muster, "I don't know, sir. I'm just tending to the wound." He stared at me for a moment, perhaps searching for a tremor in my face, some hesitation. But I was already trained for this kind of silence. The officer jotted something down on his clipboard and moved on, calling another name, as if the matter were unimportant. Inside, however, I felt as if an invisible thread had snapped. The lie had been short, but dense. It would save the man from a tension that could kill him, but it also placed me in dangerous territory, the one where you start hiding things not out of duty, but out of desire. After the officer left, I approached him. He looked at me with an expression that needed no words to express my gratitude. He didn't smile, but his eyes held a strange glow, a silent recognition. I didn't ask what he was hiding, and he didn't ask why I protected him. The pact was made. That night, while updating medical records, I realized my fingers had almost written his name on one of the sheets, even though I didn't know which one it was. It was as if the paper wanted to record him, but I had an obligation to keep him off the pages. He wasn't on the list, and now, because of me, he would remain that way. It had been raining since dawn, and the canvas of the infirmary was damp, giving off that smell of wet cloth mixed with the metallic odor of blood and the distant scent of gunpowder. I had already made my first round when I noticed his absence. His bed was empty. The sheets were rumpled, the pillow still warm. But no sign of him. I looked around as if I could find him just by changing my angle of vision. I asked one of the soldiers cleaning, and he replied, without looking at me, that they'd come for him at dawn. "Transfer," was all he said, before returning to his work as if it were a minor detail. But to me, it wasn't. I felt a tightness in my chest, as if something had been ripped from me without warning. I ran to the makeshift records area, trying to confirm where they'd taken him. But there was nothing. Not a piece of paper, not a signature, not a word. It was as if he'd vanished, taking with him the secrets I carried in my uniform pocket. I returned to the ward and stood for a few minutes beside the empty bed. The sound of the rain against the tarp seemed louder, and each drop marked the time I would waste waiting for news that might never come. I spent the rest of the day with the constant feeling that he could appear at any moment, crossing the threshold with that look that pinned me to the spot. But he didn't. That night, in the barracks, I took the handkerchief and the note from my pocket and placed them on the table. They were the only proof that he had ever existed there. I looked at them like someone looking at a map whose coordinates have been lost, and I realized that perhaps my greatest fear wasn't never seeing him again, but rather that, over time, I would begin to doubt whether he had ever truly been with me. The war ended with a weary sigh, lacking the grandeur we'd imagined. One day we were still tending to the wounded and cleaning up blood. The next, orders were given to dismantle the tents, pack up what could be salvaged, and prepare for the return. It was like waking from a nightmare, but without the sense of relief, because deep down, we knew there were things that would never be put back together. I returned to Omaha with my uniform neatly folded in my suitcase, and a stack of letters from my husband, who had also survived. The reunion was both sweet and painful. He hugged me as if rediscovering a lost piece of himself, and I hugged him back. But there was a part of me that was no longer whole, a part that remained in the field hospital, in the dark corner of the ward, where a nameless man had looked at me as if he'd known me from another life. Life went on as if nothing had happened. We had children, built a house that filled with laughter on Sundays and the smell of apple pie on holidays. But in the silent early mornings, when my husband slept and the house seemed suspended in time, I would hear that melody he hummed again, a music I could never quite place, but which returned like a gentle wave, carrying with it the weight of what was never said. I kept the handkerchief and the note in a wooden box at the back of my closet, along with old photos and war souvenirs. I never opened the paper. Sometimes just touching the box made my heart race, as if the simple act of remembering were a betrayal of the man I shared my life with. But the silence became a habit, and habits, when cultivated for decades, become part of who we are. The world moved on, my children grew up, and his name was never spoken. Still, there were nights when I would wake convinced I'd heard slow footsteps approaching my bed, bringing back that gaze. And then I'd realize it was just the wind blowing against the window. Or maybe not. It was one winter morning, many years later, that the past decided to knock on my door. The snow was falling silently over Omaha, and I was in the kitchen, slowly stirring a pot of soup, when I heard the muffled sound of the mailman pushing mail through the door. Among the bills, flyers, and late Christmas cards was a plain envelope, yellowed with age. It bore no return address, just my name handwritten in a firm script that I didn't recognize, or didn't want to recognize. I sat at the table, my cold hands gripping the paper like glass. I opened it slowly, and out fell the handkerchief he'd given me during the war. The same handkerchief, the bloodstain already almost brown, and the edges still frayed, that I'd kept for so long, and that, at some point I can't even remember, I'd lost sight of in the box where it was kept. Beside him was a crumpled piece of paper with just 3 words. Now you know. No signature, no date. That was it. I clutched the scarf to my chest and felt a wave of heat and cold at the same time. What was I supposed to know? That he survived? That he'd been nearby all these years? Or that everything I'd silently experienced wasn't the result of a memory invented by longing? I sat there for hours, the soup forgotten on the stove, listening to the clock tick away, time seemingly standing still. The sounds of the street, the children playing in the snow, everything seemed distant. All I could think about was the fact that, after decades of silence, he had found a way to speak to me, or perhaps to say goodbye forever. That night I put the handkerchief and the note back in the same place as before, but I realized they weren't just memories anymore. They were a message. And while I didn't know exactly what he wanted to tell me, the truth is, part of me didn't want to find out. It was a typical Saturday when I decided to go to the market on Main Street. Winter was already showing signs of weariness, and the shy sun was peeking through the clouds, melting the snow into puddles on the sidewalks. I was pushing my cart slowly, passing aisles filled with fresh fruit and warm bread, when I saw him. Standing in front of the grain section, his back was turned. A tall, broad-shouldered man with closely cropped gray hair. There was something about the way he rested his hand on the cart, the tilt of his neck, that made my heart skip a beat. It was a recognition that came not from reason but from somewhere much deeper. I approached without thinking, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I was only an arm's length away, I took a deep breath and touched his shoulder. He turned slowly, and for a second I swear I saw the same deep blue that had once captivated me in the infirmary. But the moment passed quickly. His eyes were a lighter shade, almost faded. His face bore unfamiliar marks. He smiled politely, as if he were a stranger caught off guard. "Do you need anything?" he asked, his voice not quite the one I remembered, but carrying an echo of it. I stared at him for a few seconds, trying to find the proof I needed. But nothing was revealed, or perhaps he chose not to reveal himself. I responded with a brief smile, apologized for the mistake, and walked away, feeling his back follow me out of the corner of my eye. On the way home, I kept reliving that moment, trying to decide if I'd seen a stranger or if he'd chosen to let me believe it. And somehow, not knowing seemed to hurt more than any certainty he could give me. Not long after that day at the market, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper in front of me. The afternoon sun streamed in through the window, illuminating the marks of time on the wood, and my face reflected in the glass. I picked up a pen and began to write. Not for him, but for my husband. The words came out slowly, as if each letter had to traverse decades of silence to reach the page. I wrote about war, about a nameless man, about a stolen kiss and a blood-stained handkerchief. I wrote about the weight of keeping something that was never entirely mine, but that shaped every choice, every silence in my life. As I wrote, my hands trembled. Not for fear of being judged. My husband was no longer alive to read it, but for the act itself, as if finally breaking the silence were a way of betraying both the past and the present. I got halfway through the letter and noticed the air had grown heavier. The smell of coffee in the kitchen seemed stronger. The sound of birds seemed more distant. I knew that if I continued, I would be putting into the world something that, until then, had existed only within me. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for this story to have an owner other than myself. I stood up, grabbed the letter, and without rereading it, took it to the sink. I lit a match and watched the paper shrink in flames, turning to ash that ran down the drain. I stood there, the smoke still in the air, feeling as if I had just saved, or damned, a part of myself. Now, at 93, sitting in this same kitchen where I burned that letter, I look at the wooden box on top of the cupboard. Inside, the stained handkerchief and the note I never opened rest like two small guardians of a story only I know. My children and grandchildren believe my life was simple, linear, made up only of the predictable gestures of a devoted wife and mother. They don't know that, behind the smiling photos and Christmas parties, lies a love that has never been spoken aloud. Sometimes, in the wee hours of the morning, I wonder if I should tell him. If I should, before time runs out, say his name. Or at least the way he looked at me, the way he touched me, the way he made me feel that, even amidst the horror, there was still beauty in the world. But when I think about speaking, silence seems more faithful. Not out of shame, but because some stories belong to mystery, and it is in mystery that they survive. Holding on to this secret all these years wasn't a constant burden. It was more like carrying a small flame that never goes out, even when we forget it's lit. It warmed me on cold days and burned me through sleepless nights. Today, looking at the scarf, I realized that perhaps he didn't give me that object to keep until we met again, but to keep the memory that he existed, and that I existed in a way no one else knew. I don't know if tomorrow I'll have the strength to climb up to the closet and open the box again. Maybe one day my grandchildren will find the handkerchief and the note and make up their own stories about them. Maybe they'll never discover that, among the faces I've kissed in my life, there was one that never appeared in any photograph. And if the end comes before I decide, perhaps I will take with me not only his name, but the certainty that, for a brief moment, even in war, we were two. And that, for me, has always been enough. Some memories never age. They remain alive, like a photograph that time cannot fade. Mine is made of silence, a pair of blue eyes, and a stained handkerchief I still keep. I spent decades building a life alongside a man I loved and respected, while a hidden part of me belonged to another, someone who perhaps never knew how much he meant. I don't know if what I experienced with him was love or just a reflection of what war took from us every day. But I know it was real, because to this day I can feel the weight of his gaze, the warmth of his hand, and the distant sound of that melody that only the two of us seem to know. Time, with all its power, could not erase this. And now, in the silence of this house, I realize that it is not fear that keeps me silent, but the desire to preserve something that was once ours alone. Some stories don't need to be told to exist. They just need to continue pulsing within those who lived them. And that's how I choose to keep mine. Not as a secret, but as an untouched piece of who I was. And who, for a few moments, we were together. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments. And leave your like so more people can hear memories that time almost erased.